Hello, everyone. My name is Sarah Gallo. I'm the librarian at the Assyrian Cultural Foundation's Ashurbanipal Library. I'm super excited to participate in the Nabu Circle lecture series. Before I present our guest speaker for today, I'd like to provide you with some context regarding the purpose behind organizing the Nabu Circle lecture series. In the annals of ancient Assyria, the god Nebu was the lord of wisdom and revered as the patron deity of scribes and scholars, instilling within the heart of Assyrian civilization a profound veneration for knowledge and erudition. Under the benevolent gaze of illustrious rulers, such as Ashurbanipal, a grand library arose in Nineveh, elevating the pursuit of scientific understanding to unprecedented heights. The Assyrian legacy of intellectual inquiry persisted, transcending epics and weaving its way into the fabric of history, as the Assyrians founded esteemed centers of learning, exemplified by the illustrious school of Nisibis, which propelled Islamic civilization into a golden age of enlightenment and progress. Enduring trials and tribulations, including the First World War, the Assyrian people clung to their unquenchable thirst for knowledge, allowing their love of learning to go undiminished. In the embrace of this noble tradition, the Nabu Circle lectures, initiated by the Assyrian Cultural Foundation, now serve as a platform for distinguished scholars to congregate to impart their insights into the annals of Assyrian history, literature, language, and culture, preserving and perpetuating the brilliance of a civilization forever marked by its profound love for wisdom. Today, we are pleased to have Professor Geoffrey Khan as our speaker. Professor Khan's topic for today's lecture is the Modern Assyrian Dialects Today. Professor Geoffrey Khan's academic journey spans over 4 decades, beginning with a first-class bachelor's degree in Semitic languages from the School of Oriental and African Studies at the University of London in 1980, and culminating in his current position as the Regius Professor of Hebrew at the University of Cambridge. Along the way, he earned a PhD in Semitic languages with a dissertation titled Extraposition and Pronominal Agreement in Semitic Languages. His career has encompassed various roles, including research assistant and research associate at the Taylor Schechter Geniza Research Unit at the Cambridge University Library, and later as a lecturer in Hebrew and Aramaic, reader in Semitic philology, and professor of Semitic philology. Currently, he holds the position of Regius Professor of Hebrew at the University of Cambridge. He has undertaken numerous short-term visiting appointments. Professor Khan's contributions have been recognized with honors, such as being elected as a Fellow of the British Academy, receiving the Lidzbarski Gold Medal for Semitic Philology, and earning honorary doctorates.
Thank you, Sarah. I can't say how excited we are today on behalf of the Assyrian Cultural Foundation to have Dr. Khan with us. He is truly, in his scientific knowledge and also passion for Assyrian dialects, has presented us year after year. I just watched a lecture of his more than 10 years ago in Chicago. The history and the Assyrian dialects, the structure of the Assyrian dialects. And as you listen to him today, I would urge that you think about preservation of our language. Oftentimes we think of standardizing our language, but also what he refers to as the treasures of our culture and heritage, which are the dialects. So without further ado, we're really honored to present Dr. Geoffrey Khan. Please, the floor is yours, Professor.
Well, good. Well, thank you very much, Robert, for that introduction, and thank you, Robert and Sarah, for the invitation to give a lecture in your lecture series. I have very fond memories of visiting the Syrian community in Chicago several times. I've spent quite a lot of time meeting various families, particularly in the Skokie area, but unfortunately I haven't been back there to Chicago for the last, well, since the pandemic, certainly. But so today I'm going to be talking about sort of overview of the Assyrian dialects, and to give you some idea about how many there are, the historical background, and how they relate to each other, and how endangered a lot of them are, and what I have been trying to do over the last 25, 30 years to help preserve them. So if I can just move my 5-point bill forward there. Okay, so the dialects spoken by the modern Assyrians today have their roots in ancient Assyria. And in ancient Assyria, the ancient Assyrians, at the period in which the date here is 850 BC, this is somewhere around the heyday of the ancient Assyrian Empire. The main spoken language was Akkadian, but however, within a couple of hundred years, there was a language shift of most speakers in this area, which we could call Mesopotamia, essentially, to the language known as Aramaic, and Aramaic became the dominant language spoken across the whole of the Near East, really. Well, certainly it became an official language across the whole of the Near East during the so-called Persian Empire, or the Achaemenid Empire, which followed the so-called Neo-Assyrian Empire, that is the ancient Assyrian Empire. We're talking about somewhere around 500 BC, and with a century or so after that. So Aramaic is Aramaic is not a one particular language. Aramaic really is a family of languages, and this is, I think, an important point to understand. I often compare it to the family of languages known as Germanic, because Germanic is a family of languages which includes languages like English, German, Danish, Dutch, Norwegian, Swedish. And so all of these languages belong to, are related through being descendants or being part of a family known as Germanic. And so Aramaic really is a family of languages. But so when but it has been found or attested in historical records for nearly 3,000 years now, in ancient inscriptions like this one, in ancient manuscripts found in various parts of the Near East, and some kind of, this is actually an incantation bow, various religious texts like these. So, but today I want to talk about the modern spoken dialects. And so the point I want to make is that although Aramaic was, or the Aramaic languages were spoken across the Near East very widely, they gradually began to disappear. And the main watershed for this sort of gradual disappearance was the arrival of the Arabs during the Islamic conquests in the 7th centuries of the Common Era, CD or AD. Now, gradually Aramaic disappeared across most of the Middle East, but it did survive as a spoken language in a number of groups. And to this day, scholars they classify the surviving forms of spoken Aramaic, which is sometimes referred to as Neo-Aramaic, into these 4 groups. One is the Tur Abdin Neo-Aramaic. Another group is the Northeastern Neo-Aramaic dialects, generally shortened to NENA, N-E-N-A. Then we have Neo-Mandaic. Then we have Western Neo-Aramaic. Now, here in the map is where these 4 surviving dialect groups are. these can be regarded as islands of Aramaic dialects, which have survived from originally this big kind of wide group of Aramaic languages, which were spoken across the whole of the area. Now, I'm going to speak about the NENA group because that is the group which I have done most of my research on, and that's the group to which the Assyrian dialects belong. Now, the northeastern Neo-Aramaic, that is the NENA dialects, and the dialects of, I'm calling them in this, says here, central Neo-Aramaic. I really mean that, like the dialects of Tur Abdin are divided by the Tigris River. So it's difficult to perhaps see in this map, but what divides essentially Tur Abdin Neo-Aramaic from NENA is the Tigris River. So, and this river, the Tigris River, one can ask oneself why one has this big divide in the dialects of Tur Abdin and then in the east. I mean, in spoken Assyrian, they refer to the Madin Chaye and the Marabai, and the point is that the eastern dialects are the east of the Tigris, and the western dialects are the ones west of the Tigris. That is the same Tur Abdin. But this boundary, the Tigris River, was more than simply a geographical boundary. It was a boundary, a political boundary in ancient times. It's a boundary between the Eastern Roman and the Persian empires in late antiquity. It's also the boundary between the Syrian Orthodoxy of Tur Abdin and the Church of the East of the ex-Sasanian lands, that is to say, the lands where the Sasanian Empire used to be before the rise of Islam. So it was a sort of both an ecclesiastical boundary and also a boundary, a political boundary in antiquity. And this is part of the reason why you have this big division in the dialects at the Tigris River. It's not purely a question of geography. Now, if we now start to concentrate on the NENA dialect, that is east of the Tigris River, the next main split to look at is the split between Christian dialects and Jewish dialects, because in this NENA group, east of the Tigris, the surviving speakers of these dialects down to modern times are either Christians or Jews. Now, but the Jewish dialects are very different from the Christian dialects. Now, the Christian dialects, which are generally referred to as Surith in Iraq, at least, and in Urmi you'd refer to, they're referred to generally as Shanat Surai. I mean, they include the dialects of the Assyrians and the Chaldeans, and also the Syrian Catholics, that is to say, communities which are found today on the Mosul plain. So the dialects of the spoken Assyrian language constitute a subfamily of the Aramaic family of languages. I mean, in fact, the whole of NENA is a subfamily of the Aramaic family of languages, but Assyrian is a subfamily of NENA. In a way, it's basically that those dialects spoken by the Assyrians who belong to the Syrian Church of the East. Chaldeans and Syrian Catholics wouldn't typically refer to their language as Assyrian, but everybody essentially would talk about either Surith or Lashanat Surai in the spoken language. Now, so the Assyrian dialects are most closely related to the Surith spoken by the Chaldeans and by the Syrian Catholic communities of the Mosul plain. For example, such as Karakosh or Baghdad, as it's called in the dialect. This is these are the most closely related dialects to the Assyrian dialects, and they all belong to the so-called subfamily of NENA, which itself belongs to the wider family of Aramaic. Now, so the Assyrian dialects are also closely related to the Jewish dialects spoken of Aramaic, spoken in Iraq and Iran. So, but then after that, the next closest relative is the language spoken by Christian communities of Turabdin. As I said, across the Tigris River to the west, there's another big group of spoken dialects, not so diverse as the NENA dialects, but they are quite different, but then to the NENA dialects, but they are still a close relative. Okay, now just to give you an idea about some of these differences in the NENA dialects, first of all, let's have a quick look at differences between Christian dialects and Jewish dialects. And this applied to dialects spoken by Christians and Jews who lived together in the same town. For example, in Suleymaniye in eastern Iraq, there were Jews and Christians until the 1950s, because the Jews, all the Jews, or virtually all the Jews, left Iraq in early 1950s. But until the 1950s, there were Jews and Christians in Suleymaniye, for example, and they had very different dialects. So Suleymaniye, the Christians would say for house, they would say besa, and for hand, they would say ida. But the Jews would say for house bela, and they would say for hand ila. And so they'd have a very different sort of dialect, and then they would have quite different forms in grammar as well, which is shown in the rest of that list there, but I won't go through all those details. But so here is the NENA dialect area where the Syrian dialects belong, and here is the Tigris River. Yeah, you can see my cursor here. And what I'm going to do, I think I've got, I'm going to now, as you see, the NENA dialects were spoken across the heartland of the NENA dialects is northern Iraq, essentially north of Kirkuk, on a line really drawn from Kirkuk all sort of slanting like this, which includes this sort of area of northern Iraq, southeastern Turkey, east of the Tigris, so across here, and then western Iran from a sort of really the northwest all the way down to Sanandaj sort of area. So just quickly to go through to give you a flavor of the kind of how these various, I'm calling them here clusters of dialects, because within the Christian dialects, one can find various clusters, clusters which are reasonably close to each other, reasonably similar. So in Iraq, these will include the dialects of the Mosul Plain, which tend to be reasonably similar, such as Karakosh, Alkosh, Telkepi, Balutle, Karamlesh. And then the next cluster will be the dialects in the far north of Iraq, close to the Turkish border in the Duhok province, mainly west of the Zab, such as Aradin and Barwar and Nerwa, for example, Derigne. Then we have the dialects east of the Zab in Arbil and Suleymaniye provinces, and these would include the dialects we have here, such as Ankawa, Shaklawa, Bidil, Khoisanjak, Suleymaniye. Bidil is a very small village right in the very far north of Iraq, just north of Diana. Southeastern Turkey and Iran, there is a cluster known as the Betan cluster, spoken in dialect in villages in the area that is now the Şırnak and Surith provinces of Turkey. These would include dialects spoken in Hertevin, or villages such as Ruma, Şuataburb, and Umra, and Jinet. I mean, there are lots of other villages as well, but that's a kind of a cluster. And then we've got the Judi cluster, these villages spoken in villages in the area of the Judi Mountain in the Şırnak province of Turkey, such as Harbole and Ishi and Hassana and things like that, and dialects such as those villages. Then we have the Tiari cluster, which is divided into Upper Tiari, Tiari Letha, and Tiari Chtetha, that is Lower Tiari, and that's spoken in villages on the western side of what is now the Hakkari province of Turkey. And then we've got the Tukhuma cluster, spoken in villages lying to the east of the Lower Tiari area. So, yeah. Now, then in Iran, we've got the Urmi cluster, which includes varieties of a dialect spoken by Christians in villages situated in the Urmi plain in northwestern Iran and the town of Urmi. And then we've got dialects of Sanandaj. Yeah, actually, no, I missed this out, the Hakkari cluster. Before that, I thought I was missing out. Yeah, we have the Hakkari cluster, which in Hakkari, it's spoken in villages in the Hakkari, northeast of Tiari, including Jilu, Baz, the Baz tribes. There was lots of Baz tribes, and then the villages in the area of Van, and also Salamas, which that belongs to this Hakkari cluster. Then we've got the cluster of dialects spoken in the far east of Turkey in Shemizdin, Gawar, and then in the Targawar mountains, which is just adjacent to the Urmi plain. They belong together in a cluster, such as Shemizdin, so it include dialects like Marpishu, and in Targawar, this will include dialects such as Mowana, and they are quite closely related to each other. So, and we've talked about the Urmi cluster, and then Sanandaj. There's one. There are Aramaic speakers in Sanandaj. They're Chaldeans. They were in Sanandaj, I should say. Now, of course, I'm speaking now about what the situation was like over 100 years ago, essentially, as you probably obviously realize, because, and this is really one of the main points of my talk today, is to show you that the situation, how endangered a lot of this massive diversity of dialects is. But let's just now go back to looking at how these various dialects relate to each other. I've given you a kind of overview of various clusters, but we can perhaps put together a little bit more broadly, lump them together in three main varieties. And these correspond to here, I'm showing here the heartland of the dialects, which is in northern Iraq. And I've divided these into 1, 2, and 3. And they are essentially those of the Mosul plain, like Karakosh, Botnai, Tiskope, Alkosh. That's the one cluster. Then up here we've got a cluster of dialects in the Duhok province, which is like Zentzach or Radin, Barwar, for example, Peshawar, all of that, Duhok province. And then the third main lump of cluster is those in the Sulaimania and Arabil provinces like Ankawa, Khoisanjak, Shaklawa, Sulaimania. Now, the Jewish NENA dialects essentially are generally categorized in two main groups: the so-called Trans-Zab group dialects, which are spoken across the river Zab to the east, and those which are spoken north of the Zab River, which is referred to as Lishana Dani. It literally means our language, just how in these dialects you say our language. Now, if we concentrate on the Christian dialects here, I mentioned those three main clusters in Iraq, certainly. One of the reasons they cluster together, it seems, is because they all have a slightly different, all have a different linguistic environment. For example, in the one group in the Mosul Plain, the main contact language is Arabic nowadays, whereas the dialects up in the Duhok province, the main contact language is Northern Kurdish or Kurmanji, whereas those dialects spoken in this Arabil and Sulaymaniyah provinces, the main contact language is Surani, that is to say, Central Kurdish. So also within the Christian dialects, there's some degree of linguistic alignment corresponding to the ecclesiastical affiliation of the communities. So we've got those dialects up in the north across the so-called the Hok province plus category, the number 2 in my categorization. They are predominantly spoken by the Syrian church, members of the community, Assyrian Church of the East. Those in the Arabil and Sulaymaniyah provinces are predominantly spoken by Chaldean, the Chaldean church is the predominant ecclesiastical alignment. And in the Mosul Plain, you get a number of Syrian Catholics like Karakosh. So you get a certain, this division is also corresponds to some degree at least, alignment with the different ecclesiastical denominations. So yeah, so here again is the NENA dialect area, and you can just get an overview here of what it looks like. I think okay. So the next thing I wanted to talk about, I've given you an idea about talked about the large number of dialects and their geographical location, historically at least, and how they cluster together in various relationships. But a very important thing to bear in mind is that there is incredible diversity across the dialects. First of all, the number of dialects is quite extraordinary. There's probably around 150 NENA dialects. But if you look at how they differ from each other, it's quite extraordinary as well. So, I mean, if you just take a word like the word for house, which is historically the original word for house would have been baitha, but the way this develops in the various dialects is very different. I mean, there are some dialects very conservative, like Gramun, where they still say baitha. But then you get various changes, like in Barwar they say betha, and the Christians of Zaho would say beta. The Jews of Bacho would say besa, and up at Tiare Letha they would say besha. The Jews of Arbil would have said bela, and in Baz you'd say bia. Oh, sorry, you'd say bea. It depends what Baz dialect actually. I mean, Arontos they would say bia, as you would in Gilu. So yeah, so there's sorry, I don't know if you can see this band here, he's getting in the way, but okay. Now, so there's also a massive diversity of villages, or there was, I should be speaking in the past tense. Here is the map of the villages of Hakkari region, for example. And so there's not only diversity of dialects and diversity of great differences between the dialects, there's also there were a very large number of communities in different villages. And this is part of the reason why there are so many dialects, but and why there's such diversity. I mean, even in the Urmi area, where nowadays one thinks of Urmi as being a single dialect. In fact, until recent times, most of the Syrians in the Urmi area were living in villages right across the Urmi plain, and there were some small differences between these various villages. Certainly, further north you went beyond the Nozli River, you were getting slight differences from those further south. Now, the point is, what I want to say is that often Assyrians feel that this vast diversity of dialects is something to be worried about, because there's a sense that the language should be unified and standardized. But I always say to Assyrians that when you have diversity in your language heritage, that is to say, when you have your people are speaking so many different dialects, this is a reflection of antiquity, because dialectal diversity reflects great antiquity, and so is one of the pieces of evidence how ancient your language is. I will say, if you compare England with the USA, in England there are many dialects, and some of them very different from each other. I mean, it's true that nowadays a lot of these dialects are being lost, unfortunately, but until, say, recent times, there was a massive number of very different dialects in England. Whereas in the USA, I mean, okay, there are slight differences in pronunciation across the English at different parts of the USA, but there is not a big dialectal diversity. And so, and this reflects the fact that English in the USA is relatively recent, whereas English in the homeland is much, much more ancient. So this dialectal diversity is a reflection of the antiquity of the dialects. Now, how far back can we trace this antiquity? Well, the actual spoken dialects themselves really were not written down until the 17th century, when various scholars started to write down certain forms of the language, mainly in things like various homiletical, ecclesiastical texts or poetry sometimes. And then, of course, we had in the 19th century the development of Bible translations. But I mean, we don't really have very early historical records of texts written in this sort of modern form of the language. So what evidence do we have of its antiquity? First of all, I've mentioned one piece of evidence, that is the actual diversity of the modern dialects. But if we dig deeply in some of the historical sources, we do see some hints about the existence of the NENA dialects in a much earlier period. For example, Bar Hebraeus is a Syriac scholar writing in the 13th century. He says that the Christians did say things like Ka'athe, which is, he heard this spoken, and this is clearly corresponds to Kathe in many of the modern dialects. So he was clearly hearing modern dialects. Now, some years ago, I found in an Arabic Materia Medica text, a text about medicine written in Zaragoza by somebody called Ibn Baklarish, writing in the 11th century. And what he did, he listed various cures and medicaments, and he gave their names in various different languages. And at one point he was talking about the milk of women, and he wrote in Arabic, so Lebanon is set. And he says, women, Toraf and Nisa, Bisurianiya, Bakhta. So women in Surianiya are known as Bakhta. Now, Bakhta is the NENA word, it's what the Assyrians would say for woman, and it's only really used in the NENA dialect. So it's a bit of a mystery how this Ibn Baklarish got a hold of this word, but it seems it must have come from a source which he got from Iraq. It seems that he was copying the medical text from Iraq, and some Iraqi doctor or physician had somehow been in interaction with NENA-speaking Christians or the Syrians in the north, and and they learned this word there. But the point is that this was the 11th century, so helps you show that Bachta was being used already in the 11th century. And we'll see that there's more evidence for even more ancient roots in a minute, and this is through looking at the way in which languages in contact with NENA dialects have had an impact on the dialects, because you see these dialects were not spoken in isolation. They were in contact with a variety of language throughout history. Some of the ones which have been in contact with include Kurdish, Gorani, and this is an Iranian language spoken in places like Hawraman and various parts of Iraq still today. Armenian, Arabic, Turkic, Persian, all of those languages had some impact on the Assyrian dialects. And in fact, because Western Asia is a meeting place for lots and lots of different language families, Iranian, Semitic, Armenian, Turkic, and even others. Now, sometimes contact can help preserve the dialects. So the fact that in Karakosh they still say th, these so-called interdental consonants like betha, either, and they say the, that is possibly has been helped, this conservativeness has been helped by the fact that the speakers of in Karakosh have been in contact with Maslawi Arabic, Mosul Arabic, where they have the sounds th and the. Whereas in Urmi, you say beta, ida, these ths and ths have been lost. And this is due to the fact that the languages in contact with the speakers of Urmi don't have a th and the. So now this looks a bit technical, but the main point I want to make here is that in the Urmi dialect, you get a thing called an unaspirated stop, a but. That means you say but without a breath of air, because typically in English you say Peter or pick or pull. You have a slight breath of air when you actually pronounce the P. But in Urmi you can say but as well, and this has developed due to the influence of, it seems, Eastern Armenian, which also has a but, and also in Urmi you have a da, which is an unaspirated T, which I represent in that way. And you get this in Urmi, for example, in words like ilpa or shapira or surta, small, the feminine word for small. Now, the point is that has come through under the influence, it seems, of Eastern Armenian. And I won't probably dwell on why you get an unaspirated but here, but only to say that the impact of contact languages. Now, it's interesting that the Urmi, the Syrian Christians of Urmi have these unaspirated stops, so they say things like shapira, but the Jews of Urmi don't. And this seems to indicate that the Jews of Urmi migrated from the south, where the Christians of Urmi migrated from the north, which you could show here. The blue line is where I think the Christians of Urmi came from, i.e. the Hakkari region, whereas the Jews would have come from further south. So you can see that although we don't have written history, but a careful analysis of the dialects as we have them today can tell us about the history of the communities, and certainly things like migration histories. Now, these languages in contact I've been talking about often have historical layers, so we can get different layers. Nowadays, for example, in central the Kurdish region, we've got Sorani, which is central Kurdish, is the main spoken language. But in an earlier period, the dialect, the main contact language was Gorani. In Urmi region, the main contact language now is Turkic, so like Azeri Turkish. Whereas in an earlier period, Kurdish was the dominant language. And now this historical layering of contact languages applies to even more ancient period. If you go back to the time of the Assyrian Empire, where, as I said at the beginning of the lecture, this is where these dialects originate from. Akkadian was the language of this the ancient Assyrians, but then there was a language shift of speakers of Akkadian either to Aramaic or to Iranian, because Aramaic is the language we're talking about. But in terms of language contact, there was a shift of speakers of Akkadian also to Iranian. So, but probably, I mean, I should have perhaps added that here, what is probably more important for us is the fact that also Akkadian speakers shifted to Aramaic. So they shifted to Aramaic and they shifted to Iranian, essentially. But so how do we know that the speakers of the modern dialects today, how do we know that their ancestors originally spoke Akkadian, then shifted to Aramaic? Well, it's because we have a lot of Akkadian words in the modern dialects. So in Karakosh, for example, there's a lot of words such as Bakhshima, which means a storeroom. It comes from Akkadian Bit Khashimi. Rachisa is a pile of straw, and this from Akkadian Rachitsu. Karakosh and the Mosul Plain that say Billa for an external door, which is from Akkadian Abulu. Also, many of the villages up in the north of Iraq, they use terms in agriculture which are of Akkadian origin, such as Mishara. In Barwar, this is where your rice paddy fields, where you grow your rice. This is an Akkadian word from Musharu. So these Akkadian words must have come in when the ancient Assyrians shifted from Akkadian to Aramaic. And they, in this process of language shift, they brought with them many of the Akkadian words. Even some of the forms of the grammar of the Assyrian dialects possibly have their roots in Akkadian. Perhaps I'll skip over this because it's a little bit technical, but it's good to show that these things called infinitives, like ptacha, for example, is seems to be imitating Akkadian pattern, and which is much closer to Akkadian than literary Syriac. So it's an interesting point that the modern dialects, in many respects, are a more clear descendant of a Akkadian-speaking community than literary Syriac. Literary Syriac, which people think is the sort of the ancient, standard, pure language, in fact, is actually not so closely related to Akkadian, it seems, than the spoken languages, which is a very important point because it shows you how important these spoken languages are for your language heritage. It's not, the literary language is not necessarily the most ancient or the most conservative form of language. Now, it's an interesting point that the Jewish NENA dialects have generally converged more closely with the grammar and lexicon of the contact languages than is the case with the Christian NENA dialects in the same region. This is probably because the Jews tended to be living in towns more, and there were traders interacting with people in markets, whereas Christians were typically working as agriculturalists in villages, so it's slightly more isolated from the surrounding population. So I'll probably, since I see the time is passing, I'll probably skip over the next few slides, I think. Only to say that, as I said earlier, that if you look at the dialects, it gives you an insight into the history of migration. Another thing which looking at dialects does is you can show social interaction between people, because, as I said, the very fact you get differences between, quite big differences between Christian and Jewish dialects, shows that there were different social networks. But still, there are, interestingly, in the same area, there is some degree of convergence between the Christian and Jewish dialects. So in Khoisanjak, for example, the Jews and Christians would have a rather similar way of saying he is drinking. They would say la kshate and la shate, and the Jews would say this la is not the negation, it's not. And Barwar say holeshtaya, and the Jews of Barwar region would say ileshtaya, which is quite similar. So there is some degree of convergence, and that must be explained by the fact that there was although the communities were separate, there must have been some degree of social networking and good relations between the two communities. And in fact, this is definitely the case in Barwar, because here's Barwar, which I visited I've visited a couple of times in the last few years. And in Barwar, there was a village known as Betan Barwar, where Jews used to live. And the Jews and Christians had very good relations. They were living next to each other, basically in adjacent villages. And they would call each other Qariwa. And then, so when Christians, one of my informants, I met in actually some of the Barwanaya in Chicago. I mean, they'd tell me how when they were children, they would run across the fields from NENA and places like that, and go to Betan Barwar, where they would listen to stories told by the Jewish rabbi there. And so they had a very close relationship with the Jews, and this is reflected in the dialect. So now the final thing I want to talk about is the fact everything I've described, all this big, massive diversity of dialects, and this ancient roots of the dialect, and this incredible ancient heritage is now all endangered. And of course, we all know why it's endangered. It's because of these terrible events which have happened to the Syrian community over the last 100 years or more. Of course, beginning with the Assyrian genocide in 1915, and these are some pictures, and then through a variety of upheavals and wars and displacements in following decades. For example, in the 1970s, the surviving communities up in Turkey in the Judi area were all displaced, and their dialects were the villages were destroyed by during the war in the so-called Anfal campaign. And this is a picture of one of the Judi villages that was taken in the night before the destruction in Harboli. Yeah, and then we've got, of course, ISIS in 2015. This terrible destruction of this is Baghdad, terrible destruction and it's tragic. Refugees situation, displacement of people, and the fact that now the result is that the Christian population of Iraq is just reducing rapidly, and it's now only, I say here, it's now estimated to be between 250,000. It's probably less than that now, but is rapidly diminishing because of these massive disruptions and just displacements. Now, this all means that there is an increasing diaspora of the Syrians. I mean, obviously, this diaspora started a long time ago, back after the Syrian genocide, but it's just continued, and it's meant that a lot of these Assyrian dialects, especially the small ones, are now highly endangered and really on the verge of extinction. And in fact, another factor, and very unfortunately, the COVID took a really devastating blow, really affected some of the surviving speakers of some of the small dialects in Iraq. For example, there was a very small village called Bidjel, is north of Diana, where this is up in Barzan, where I visited some years ago. And one of the final speakers of this dialect, who spoke it well, called Tigris River, he died, unfortunately, of COVID in 1921. And here's a recording I made of him briefly. I can just... I mean, we could listen to him quite a long time, but I won't. But basically, unfortunately, now that he passed away during he died of COVID, which and apart here is a recording I made of a storyteller in Nala from Tiare. He shows you how when a dialects are lost, it's not only the language that's lost, but also a lot of oral literature, oral memory. And for example, there are not many, there are less and less people now who remember these wonderful stories which the Assyrians would tell each other in the villages. And I just listen to
it. أو قيمة بريخ لا نديذين توبتل سوس شوبه كلا خبينا خاوة شيري كوما خاوة كوما شيري مختمرت نخام عليه.
Okay, we won't listen to the whole story. It goes on for about an hour. But okay, the Jews all left in the 1950s, so most of the Jewish dialects now are highly endangered now. So what's to be done, and this is what I've been trying to do for the last 30 years, is to undertake a massive program of documentation of the NENA dialects to preserve them, a memory, and preserve records of them before they completely disappear. And so here's me, for example, doing some recording, and this was actually in Georgia, in a village of Kanda, where some of the Urmi speakers and Salama speakers migrated.
itwa khanash sava itwa khachulukhta itwa li khabruna hamda janu bakhtu hamda obrunu bkhayva jude chulukhta khacho chola twalo beta sura.
Yeah, so that documentation is a really important thing, and documentation means recording, but not only recording, but also very painstakingly writing a grammar and a lexicon of the language, working closely with speakers. Now, a very important part of this documentation task is working with the Assyrians themselves, the community and the younger people. And for several years, I've been trying to encourage the young Assyrians to work with me, and I've been training them how to transcribe and document their spoken dialects, and I've undertaken various workshops. And here's a workshop I organized in Iraq a few years ago. This was in Ankawa, and then there was also in Duhok, I ran a workshop, and this is to really increase to help to bring the younger Syrians, into this sort of program I've been undertaking over the last 30 years, and I'm happy that I'm being privileged to be working with a few young Assyrians now in some of my projects, though it would be nice if more would join this enterprise and help with the documentation program. And what I always say to Assyrians, and I hope this would become clearer as I end this lecture now, that I say, your heritage is in your mouth.